morning. Are we good?
Good morning.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so very excited to join all of you. I am John Chiang. I'm the state treasurer. I have this incredible privilege of welcoming 3 high-impact movers and shakers, change agents, and diversity in the private sector space. I have Simpson, who's just a real jewel over at CalPERS. She's the investment director of sustainability. Ginger Liu, who has been a longtime friend, who has served both in the private and public sectors at the highest offices, even so at the White House, who's now managing director at Cube Hydro Partners. And then I have Helena Morrissey, who's head of personal investing, legal and general investment management, who has traveled from afar to be with all of us. So this is the incredible panel that we have. As mentioned, I am the state treasurer, and I have the good fortune of serving on both the boards of CalPERS and CalSTRS. And back in 2008, I had this incredible staff person, Mei Tom, who said, John, we need to make sure that we continue to not only drive change in public sector leadership, but we drive change in private sector leadership. And so we sent off a letter to CalPERS and CalSTRS saying, you know, what are we going to do affirmatively to make sure that we recognize the incredible talent pool that exists that we need to elevate to the highest level so that we can have impactful change happening in the private sector. And so I'm very excited because of that, because I get to hear the updates of what's working, what's not working. And so, Ann, let's start off with you. Tell us a little bit about what's happening at CalPERS, what you think, what you're most proud of happening at CalPERS, and then we'll start with that question.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. The first thing I'd say about what's working is look at this room. It's extraordinary. The diversity of participation, the ideas, and the fact that we've moved away from just feeling we have to, in a pious manner, agree. Diversity, yes, indeed. Yes, is one of those topics where we all have to say how very important it is, much like good manners and not eating off your knife. You know, we've moved away from it being in that realm into a topic where we're actually getting to, I suppose, a stage of maturity to talk about barriers and even to look at the evidence critically, not just be scrabbling around to find an example and then squirming with embarrassment when we find a board with several women on it and everything goes badly wrong. Wells Fargo, for example, you know. So this idea that diversity will always be a predictor of high returns and good behavior and general wisdom, I think moving into a different discussion, and this is, I think, where we are at CalPERS, is saying what we need as good fiduciaries is companies that are going to produce returns for us over the long term. And that means having a high-quality board. And that means a board that's independent, that's competent, and diverse for all the reasons that we've talked about. So I think on the conversation, we're moving away from the warm words into rolling our sleeves up and thinking about the planning. I think what isn't working is the idea that the appearance of being busy on the topic is good enough. And what we need to move to is looking at, well, what are the goals? The way that we empower people to move towards those outcomes is another matter. So I think on the CalPERS front, and working with other investors, not least our sister fund CalSTRS, we've realized as the owners of companies, it's our responsibility to, first of all, in the US, to ensure we have the right to hire directors. So we've done a lot of campaigning around the theme of majority voting, but also to give ourselves the ability to nominate candidates. And we've had a big focus on proxy access for that reason. So until we get these opportunities to be more involved with board appointments, I think we're going to find a continuing picture of boards sitting on their hands. If you look at the tenure, as it's known, like how many years have directors been in post, you'll see that it's getting longer and longer and longer, which is marvelous for continuity and experience and people who knew all about, you know, the Second World War, or my generation. But, you know, the challenges that companies are facing are global, they're about complexity, they're about dealing with diverse populations of consumers and employees, and it's really not good enough. So we've got to tackle the issue of tenure, so boards can be refreshed, and we've got to give investors the rights to be able to engage with boards so that we can start to get some, you know, some real results. But if we don't get all those things in place, we will continue to be stale, you know, and we are rather stale at the moment.
Terrific, thank you. Ginger, headline? What headline do you want to offer?
Well, I'd like to start my session on giving a story. A few years back, I was working with one of the big 3 accounting firms. And one day, the boss came in and said, well, you're going to get a new partner to manage your group. I said, fine. The day arrives. I walk into Charlie's office. He takes one look at me and says, oh, by the way, he was coming over from Singapore. I said, fine. So Charlie takes one look at me and says, are you the tea lady? And I said, excuse me? You know, the tea cart. Do you bring the tea in the morning to all the partners? And I said, Charlie, we need to talk. Fast forward, let's just say he never did that again. But more importantly, he became a great mentor of mine. But really, times have changed. But it's an illustration of how stereotypes, cultural differences, expectations still permeate our society, still permeate decision-making. As you heard from our morning speakers, it can be explicit, implicit, very unconscious. And I think we need to continue to work on the cultural dynamics, how we embed the DNA into the corporate structure. I have served on 4 corporate boards. I have served on 3 large foundation, not-for-profit, donor type of organizations. I've been on 3 audit committees, the chair of an audit and finance committee. And I will tell you, those positions came because the leadership at the top made a decision, first of all, reached out, and then made a decision and a commitment that there was going to be changes at the board level, and that there was going to be, diversity in managing these responsibilities. I think the other things that have made contributions is, frankly, the various federal regulations at the SEC, whether it's having independent boards, having independent auditors, all the infrastructure that companies are now required to put into place. That's one key component. Having initiatives such as the 3D program that CalPERS and CalSTRS have implemented is very important. But we have given a lot of tools, and you've heard from other people now about how we actually implement those tools. I think what's working, the tools are working and are helping. The push from institutions like CalPERS and CalSTRS and corporate leaders is also working. What's not working is when people feel like they are being required or compelled to do it. In other words, they're doing it because they're being forced to do it. And so I have been approached by someone who literally called me up one day and said, well, we have to put a woman on the board. Which was not the best way to open an interview phone call. And it really sort of told me, okay, this is the mindset of the company, and unfortunately that still exists. We have leaders, such as Cisco, obviously Apple and Microsoft and others that have taken the initiative. I'm also seeing initiative now at the smaller companies, the private companies, but again, because someone's frankly looking over their shoulders. I'm intrigued. One thing I would like to propose as this discussion evolves is that CalPERS and CalSTRS sort of take the next step, and that is develop, ask for a census, ask for a demographic review of their portfolio companies, the fund managers. Now I know Proposition 209 prohibits the state agencies from considering certain ethnic or gender characteristics in their decision making. It does not prohibit them from collecting that information. And so I think there's great power when you have an institution such as CalPERS and CalSTRS asking for such information. I know that some of the New York pension funds are thinking about this as well. And I know some corporations are now, who have their own investment arms, are thinking about asking for this demographic information as well. And that's, what gets measured. Well, I think that's useful information. So I'll stop there.
Very good. Helena?
Thank you. Well, obviously, I was up earlier and talked a little bit about the perhaps surprising success. Certainly, it exceeded my own expectations that we've had in the UK in terms of accelerating the pace of change in the boardroom around gender diversity anyway. And a couple of factors that I didn't really have time to mention that I think it's worth emphasizing were also instrumental in driving that. There was quite a reflection in the UK, quite a moment of introspection after the financial crisis, which I haven't seen necessarily happen I didn't see it happen at the same time in the US. I maybe have been too remote from it. But there was a sense that actually, the homogenous, as we'd put it, boards had contributed to the financial crisis, and that we needed to have a big review of governance generally. We have, obviously, wasn't introduced then, but we have term limits effectively. It's not mandatory, but the comply or explain rule means that after 9 years, a non-exec director is no longer really considered independent. And that certainly helped to give us the turnover that enabled us to have some opportunities to populate the boards with new candidates. So all of that was contributing to what happened. I do think, and again, I only touched on it very briefly, that shareholder engagement, which we're going to be picking up in this panel, has been somewhat patchy on the issue, that we've had a lot of people, again, paying lip service to the issue, saying how important it is, and relatively few using, putting their money where their mouths are, using their voting powers. They don't necessarily have to divest. Elgin, that I've recently joined, has a large index business, so it has the approach that actually needs to be activist because it has to stay as an owner. But actually, again, that's starting to have some teeth. We escalate the issue, obviously constructively engaging at the beginning. If not much is done about it, then we'll escalate and vote against the nomination committee chair or all other members of the boards. But actually creating this joined up approach today has been very exciting for me to see how much has been about innovation, about forensic analysis of the data, and then again, innovating, thinking about new ideas, not just sticking to methods that clearly haven't yielded results. One thing that was touched on in the preceding panels, which I would like to pick up on, because it's not necessarily been dealt with yet, is thinking about how we move from just one type of diversity. We've talked about, silos of diversity, and I've come to the view that actually we're sort of always going to be holding ourselves back if we approach it as one issue at a time. And people get fatigued as well by the whole topic. Oh, we've dealt with women, now we have to deal with ethnicity, and then what about LGBT, etc. And that's not really the point. The point is we're trying to change the thinking. And I've come to the view that actually it's a bit bizarre, the current situation, that in fact about 10% of the population, the white, heterosexual, middle-class men, has been in charge in most areas of life over the rest. And actually what we need to think about is the whole, the 100%. I was participating in the National Corporate Directors, the Black National Corporate Directors Conference in California last autumn. And I shared the stage with Jim Murren, CEO of MGM, who talked about how they decided to go for all the others, that they looked at their own customer base and realized that the majority, 2/3, weren't white, middle-class, middle-aged men, and therefore they were trying to approach things more holistically. And I would like to think about that because I think it's, as in what we can do to get that culturally more of a challenge, to think bolder, to think bigger, to think of turning some of the practices. Paul in the previous panel, I think, talked about, really turning things on their head. And so we're not just on autopilot trying to squeeze a few women into the existing structure, but trying to think actually about recruitment, about promotion, and so forth. So just a few thoughts picking up from some of the things that have already been said.
Helena, let me ask the follow-up question. So what are the next steps, right? Because in my service, I did. First year I sent out, we need more diversity because of heritage and ethnic and racial background. In my second year, I said we need to include more women. A few years later, I said we need to include people from the LGBT community. A couple years ago, after a meeting with the UN, I asked my colleague Betty Yee, let's send a letter to make sure that CalPERS has people with more climate change expertise serve on the boards. So, right, you addressed that, or you referenced it. So how do you encourage those boards to look at it holistically?
Well, I think, first of all, is to make sure that when we're recruiting, we're not trying to construct a sort of manufactured, we'd call it a boy band or a pop band, you know, where you've kind of got one sporty one sexy one, you know, like you're not trying to do that, but you say instead actually instruct your search firm. It came up earlier that people were referencing, and this certainly happened with the 30% Club in the UK, that the chairs of the board actually said to their search firms, I don't want to see the same list. We recognize that we have a tight lid. It's all the former CEOs or the existing CEOs in other firms. What I want to see is people who are below your radar screen, and I want to see people of color, I want to see women, I want to see people with different socioeconomic backgrounds, digital experience that we don't have, younger people. We haven't talked about that at all, very important if we're going to be relevant. And actually threw it wide open. And one of the chairmen said to me, actually what happened was we lifted the lid just by instructing, by saying actually, it's not that I'm just looking for a woman. It'd be wonderful it was a black woman, you know, who also has various other characteristics, but actually what I want is I want to just start somewhere and shake it up. And then it has, in a few boards, naturally evolved, but it's like one of those push-pull. You're not leaving it all to chance, that 100 years at the start of the day. We're trying to leapfrog. We're trying to create that 0 to 1 moment.
I think what the UK has done on this is a tremendous example, but I do want to emphasize that in the United States, we've had to build the shareholder rights that make it possible to even vote on directors or have dialogue with companies or put candidates forwards. If you're starting there, it's a bit like the old joke, you know, how do you get to Tipperary? Oh, I can tell you, but I wouldn't start from here. And we're starting from here in the US, and I think it's the same in other markets which are lagging on the diversity agenda, say for example Japan. It's because there's a weak regime of shareholder rights. And so I think the critical question when we're talking to boards is not to say, well, what about diversity? And as John says, we've always approached this in this holistic approach. We're not looking for, you know, I love this idea of a boy band with a sexy and a sporty one. I want to go to the board of Exxon and say, okay, who's sporty? Who's that sexy, you know? Anyway, as we're sticking with Exxon, the way
The new
Exxon,
criteria.
The image of the day will be.
Well, I was the wrong one to go to the Exxon shareholder meeting. You should have gone.
No, but let's keep with Exxon for a minute. Why? Because they're one of the largest companies in our portfolio, and they're the largest oil and gas company. So the whole discussion there is about board quality. And they, following shareholders first winning the right to vote yes or no, imagine that you have an election, but you can only vote yes. That is the Delaware law default provision in the United States. So slowly but surely we get to the point where you can also withhold your vote, as it's known, and vote against directors. And then last year, led by New York City, who we've been in partnership with on this, we won proxy access, which means shareholders have the ability to nominate candidates. And lo and behold, in the discussion about climate change and climate competent boards, which our own boards had brought to our attention as an important feature, Exxon has appointed Dr. Susan Avery, who's a climate scientist. She's not a former CEO, she's not been on a board before, and yet she's going to bring expertise to Exxon's board, which is highly relevant. So I think the lesson of this is, first of all, you need your shareholder rights regime in place. You won't make progress otherwise. But secondly, we then need to look at the question of the company's long-term strategy, and then check what are the skills and experience that you have, and make sure that you've got diversity in that mix. Because we're going to struggle hard to find a company which is selling to that minority group known as the middle-aged white men of the world, who you just mentioned. There's not big business there. Most of the world is diverse. Most of the challenges involve complexity. So what diversity brings, I think, is a much better decision-making process. It's not about representing different groups. And the research that we've looked at over the last couple of years is really that any dimension of diversity brought into the boardroom seems to add value. Julia Dawson's work from Credit Suisse, which I think you touched on some of it, was extremely interesting for us, because where you can get hold of data and you're breaking up groupthink, it seems that this presents benefit. It might be longer, slower decision making, not such a bad thing, but actually the outcome that you get is better.
I think that's the point I was trying to make with the idea that if CalPERS, CalSTRS, and other institutions start asking information, surveying, getting information about the demographics, the census of their fund managers, of the portfolio companies as well.
Right.
So there's really several different tiers. You have the public companies, you have the financial institutions that invest in these companies, then you have the fund managers who actually, have the separate alternative assets allocations, then you have the private portfolio companies. You can actually have an influence on the entire food chain, the entire value chain of where you are making investments. And I think that information combined with, as you were saying, looking at issues of quality, looking at other strategic value brought to the particular company, will make it a much more holistic process than just this silo and that silo.
Right.
So Ginger, how do you identify that value proposition, right? Because you gave that example of saying we need to have a woman on the corporate board. So how do you tie back to what Ann just shared and making sure that you have that, frankly, that they don't even have to ask that question?
I'm on the board of a company right now that is in the government contract world, actually in the intelligence world, and we were lacking expertise in a very specific niche, which one would say is probably dominated by men. So I took it upon myself as a board member that I would lead the search and bring forth a roster of qualified candidates. Over a period of time, and we accessed a number of networks, including working with a headhunter, the networks of all the board members themselves, et cetera. We ended up identifying a two-star general, happens to be a woman, in this space. And so I think, if first and foremost you start off with, what are the skill sets?
Right.
And then what's the value add that person can bring? And then when you look at the person's scope of qualifications and you add the element of diversity, we want to make sure that at least a third of the candidates were diverse, broadly defined. It's ethnic, gender, LGBT, whatever it might be. And kind of a de facto Rooney rule, so to speak. But we want to make sure that we presented a diverse pool to the entire board and to the CEO, and it's worked out beautifully.
Helena, so when you target, are you focused on other boards of directors, or are you working the shareholders, a larger audience? How do you contemplate?
You mean the executive level of
Yes.
coming up? Yes, no. Certainly the 30% Club and other initiative involvement started with the boards just partly because that's where the data is, and obviously it is symbolic and a powerful oversight, but actually now most of the work is on the so-called pipeline. I never like that expression when I think of it as an ecosystem. You want to kind of change, have diverse people as they come up through the talent, be able to change the culture and the ways of doing things. Would it be okay to just ask a question back? Because I think it's something quite important from somebody who's obviously somewhat distant to the US corporate governance framework, but it seems to me that it's quite perplexing from an outside point of view of why the shareholder rights regime is lacking, and whether, since we've got all this huge money in the room here, whether more could be done. I mean, clearly we see activist shareholders coming through and really being quite aggressive with the companies that they get involved in. Would there not be appetite from companies to actually say, yes, we should, it would help us to progress as well on not just this issue but other issues, or is that just off the table? I should emphasize that we are working on things like board refreshment. I mean, Elgin is partnering with CalSTRS, OPERS, and APG of the Netherlands to escalate voting where there has been a lack of turnover on boards. But it still seems to me that we're scrabbling around the edges rather than thinking, we should be rethinking the relationship between the shareholders and company management and boards.
Yeah, so I don't think it was spend time.
Big one today. We've got 5 minutes to do that.
Legal history, Delaware law, and how all of this
I
ended
realise
up.
I'm glossing over,
And
but where there's a will,
that's okay. Glossing over when you've got a short of time is all right. Shortcuts are okay. So there were specific reasons in the 1980s why Delaware's default provision changed, and it was really to protect companies from hostile takeovers, as were many other, what are viewed as bad governance provisions, ways to protect companies from their owners who could not be trusted to do the right thing. And I think that there's still a flavor of that in concern about short-termism. And we've had this conversation with activist funds on several occasions where we've wanted to defend a company against a raid. We say, right, we call ourselves shareholders, but really you've got owners, traders, and raiders. And the owners may have a very long-term interest in where the company's going, which is at odds with a short-term activist fund. But we've challenged them as well about, concern about short-term focus, but also how they're selecting directors with often a lack of diversity. Often the explanation to us has been, well, we know him, good man. We know him from this company or that campaign or this golf club. And this idea of personal relationships is what drives the building of the team. Now, to take that out into the hazardous and uncertain world of someone you don't know, you don't play golf with, you were not at the same regiment or school or dorm or fraternity, then you've got to start coming right out of your traditional way of putting your team and leadership body together and start thinking about, well, what are the criteria? And then how do I start to build a relationship of trust such that I would put this person on my slate if I'm an activist fund or I'm on a nominating committee. So this really comes now to sort of updating the story about 3D. The idea of 3D is to meet what was originally considered to be a problem in supply. You think the problem on board diversity, we talk to companies and say, if only we knew some talented women who could take it on, they're not so busy making tea and all the important things that you ladies have to deal with. Goodness me, bringing up babies and gosh, don't know how you fit it all in. But the question was always, well, these people may exist, but we certainly don't know them. So the idea behind 3D, which was really modeled on ProNed from the UK way back when, was, well, let's put this pool of talent together. And we built several hundred candidates. We had a lot of outreach to organizations. And then guess what? They sat there all dressed up with nowhere to go. There was so little interest. It was, hard not to wipe a tear and say, that was a lot of work. We've done a lot and nothing's really happened. So the second phase of work, we realized it's not just supply, we have to work on the demand side. And that's where the investors come in. If investors, the owners of companies, aren't critically interrogating the chair of the nominating committee, they're not using their vote, using the ability to file proposals, we're not going to create the demand. So we're now at this interesting stage where we've actually, with STIRS, transferred 3D to a new home. It's with Equilar, which is a data company, as you know, and they have a suite of services around board diversity. And I don't think I'm giving away trade secrets. The last time I spoke to David Chiang, who's the founder of Equilar, they had 50 public companies searching the pool of talent, and 3D is the biggest pool of talent in the suite. And here with the search words, technology, international, and female. So that is a start. But I think it is going to be push and pull. It's not going to move forward unless we get both supply and demand in the right place.
That's great. Ginger, Anne just referenced, right, we needed to create greater demand. What do you recommend for people in this room who are passionate about this issue? And Helena, I'll ask that same question before we take questions from the audience. What can we do to involve the audience in this particular effort?
I think following up on what Anne was saying is that really the initiative coming from the leadership, senior management team, is really how each one of us, each one of you can be, affirmatively contributing to this change. And it's doing it because you are trying to add financial, strategic value to your company. And you're trying to also make sure that you're reflecting the customer base that you have and the client base that you have. And so I think we have talked about some of the statistics earlier today. We've talked about some of the tools, 3D. And now it's really taking some of that information and bringing it to your board or bringing it back to your senior management team and saying, how do we move this agenda forward? Because it is in the best interest of that company to do so.
So I think we all have to take responsibility of it. I think actually if we look back at the, at least modern history, we can track how groupthink has been so damaging in so many situations, not just the financial crisis, but all the work done on it originally by Irving, I forgot the surname now, Penn, that's not right, on the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and all the work on the Challenger space shuttle disaster showed that when people kind of are patting each other on the back and saying what a great idea rather than challenging each other, disasters happen. And I think actually elevating it from being in any way sense of nice to have, oh, it would be great if you could, do something about this diversity, and actually making it really an essential part of backing a company, backing a management, it's sort of incumbent on all of us. And I think that actually taking that as a responsibility, and not just somebody else will look after that, but each of us, I think, can take our ownership and our fiduciary duties really seriously and elevate it to being, taken seriously by all of the people that we are talking to.
Fantastic. So this is now your time. Does anybody have any questions? We have a question over here. We have a question in the middle, and a question to the side. Please introduce yourself and who you're with for the audience.
Hi, my name is Samir Shah. I'm the CEO of MBS Mantra. Helena's mentioned the financial crisis a couple of times and about how you're trying to influence boards to try
Could you put the mic up to your mouth?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Helena's mentioned the financial crisis a couple of times and how you're trying to influence boards to increase diversity to reduce risk, essentially. My research shows that actually a large portion, the majority of the risk that led to the financial crisis was created by actions of central banks having identical thinking. And I'm wondering if the large investors in this room have the ability to influence the makeup of central banks and to increase their diversity of thinking. Thanks.
Did you want to?
I'm happy to start with that. So I think it wasn't just board's fault, obviously, you're quite right. We were all complicit, arguably, and I think what you can look at when you look at policy-making circles, as well as boards, as well as other people involved with the authorities, then we have a very small gene pool that has been, the same ideas have been made to feel that they must be right, because we all are smart people and we all see each other. So I completely agree that we should look beyond boards. I think I'm just using it as shorthand, really, for some of the work that we know we need to do. Sometimes I use the example of Royal Bank of Scotland board, obviously in the UK, a catastrophic failure. They had an 18-member board, 17 out of 18 were men. Most of them had grown up in the same street in Edinburgh. It's kind of, if you look at the photos of the board directors, it's like playing a game of Spot the Difference, really. Same age, same, so yes, it's just I think we have to break down these problems into sort of pieces, and if we've got what we have seen in the UK and in some other parts of the world, like Australia, I think, is that once the wheel gets turning, other parts of the value chain sort of jump on board and think, actually, this is part of being modern, part of being relevant, and part of having the license to operate. So I think it's a good point.
Either one of you want to comment on that?
I was very involved in some of the policy making at the time in 2009, 2010. When we basically inherited this the financial crisis. I was working at the White House at the time, and we had corporations, bankers coming in and saying, well, obviously we need to work together to find solutions and blah, blah, blah. And another part of the administration was also pushing for diversity in leadership and management and in the board. We got this feedback saying, well, now is not the time to experiment. I mean, we said, well, you guys were the ones who made the original decisions. So if you're going back to the same guys, by the way, and you're asking them for new thoughts, or new solutions, do you think you're going to get the same thoughts and the same recommendations? And it's interesting because it's repeating itself right now. And without making any type of political commentary, we have 10 men who are reviewing the Healthcare Act. And we kind of went, and I was wondering, where are the women in this process?
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Sopal Ear. I'm a professor of diplomacy and world affairs at Occidental College and a trustee of the Nathan Cummings Foundation. So I couldn't agree more with what you've said about the need for board turnover. In fact, one of the most admired, really best performing public companies out there, Berkshire Hathaway, has got a board that averages 72 and a half years of age.
I'm sorry, can you speak into the,
Okay.
a little bit closer?
I'm trying to, okay. Berkshire Hathaway has a board of averaging 72 and a half years of age. Chairman is 86. And, you got 93-year-olds on the board. So
Anybody can.
the point here is that...
I'm sorry, we can't hear you. So Berkshire Hathaway, and then we lose you. So just,
Okay.
Question.
Is this better?
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So yes, the need for turnover is tremendous and a couple of boards. And obviously diversity here is a problem.
We can't.
I'm sorry, could you just ask your question? Because it's hard to hear you, so we just want to capture the absence.
Yeah, I can have, I know this one. Okay.
Okay, Ann?
Yeah, just to make sure we've understood your question. The Financial Choice Act just cleared the House of Representatives, and it has a proposal in it which would raise the threshold for share owners filing proposals. Right. So the current threshold in the United States is low, but also I would say there's not a vast number of shareholder proposals that are filed. Most of them are settled through engagement and negotiation. So in any year, you may have 200 or 300. And these proposals come from a very wide variety of share owners. Talking about diversity, you have it. You've got small retail shareholders, you've got fund managers, Hermes, for example, from overseas, and you've got big funds like CalPERS and New York and CalSTRS filing. And the reason we file proposals is because we want to talk to our fellow shareholders about an issue which thinks very important for the company to address, and we haven't had a response from the company board that's satisfactory. So this to us is a very flourishing and important part of the ecosystem, to use Helena's nice analogy, in corporate governance in the United States. Now, the current level of $2,000, the proposal is to move it to 1%, which will mean that this becomes the privilege of the billionaire investor. And certainly, I think although CalPERS and other big funds would be able to, come together and use this facility, there's real benefit in having the diversity of thinking that comes through the shareholder proposal process. So we know that this bill has to go to the Senate. We know companies are worried about costs, and we agree. We don't want to have frivolous or high-cost issues, but this is something which would diminish the process overall. And if shareholders can't file proposals, I think what you'll find is that they'll turn their vote to the board directors, and they'll be voting against directors. So we'll lose something if it does become law.
Thank you. The last question, and whoever responds, we have less than a minute.
Thank you. I will be quick. I'm Annalisa Barrett from the University of San Diego and Value Edge Advisors. And my question is, actually, I'll just ask for general comments. Helena mentioned age diversity in the
I'm
corporate
sorry,
board.
can you put it up to your mouth? Tilt it towards your mouth. Okay, go ahead.
Helena mentioned age diversity in the corporate boardroom, and I'd love to get thoughts on the benefits of having a board members coming from different generations. I just finished studying in the U.S. Age diversity is not strong, so I'm curious as to how you think companies might benefit.
Somebody want to provide 2 or 3 sentence response?
Couple of sentences. I think what we've seen, certainly we still have a problem in the UK, and I don't wish to imply that we've solved all these, because we haven't. The average age of board directors is still over 60 of non-exec directors. But there is appetite, and I think it is really the point of realization is that technological experience, digital experience, having digital natives, it's a really important part of almost every company's strategy now, and there is a sense of not wanting to just have people in the executive team that couldn't be questioned. So we have seen a few examples. Martha Lane Fox, who set up lastminute.com in her 30s, was appointed to the Marks and Spencer board, for example. And basically, I think most of the focus at the moment is around that digital experience. But as people join and contribute more generally, we have a unitary board system, as you do here. I think people are realizing actually by shaking it up more, there are as yet sort of unquantifiable benefits, and actually changing the nature of the discussion also is broader than just getting some digital expertise.
Very good. So we're having lunch. So lunch location is the same as where you had breakfast. Thank you all for your participation and attention. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you, John. Thank you.